Ladies, gentlemen, welcome to the world-famous Apollo Theater. WNYC's 10th annual Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. celebration is part of the Apollo's Uptown Hall series. And here to welcome you to today's event, please welcome the President and Chief Executive Officer of the Apollo Theater, Janelle Procope.
Thank you so much for joining us for today's conversation. While MLK Day is and should be a day to reflect and honor a great man, Dr. King's legacy calls on us to do more, to be better. The themes of racial inequality, economic inequality, social justice, these are all things that Dr. King addressed in many of his speeches and were central to his life's work. They still resonate and continue to be very much top of mind and particularly relevant today.
There is much work to do. And for those who believe that somehow the presence of an African-American couple in the White House means that we are in a post-racial era, you are living an illusion. The glaring realities, the tragic events of the past several years have shown us that our country has a long way to go to overcome its trouble with our racialized history. When there are so many who are yearning to breathe free, when there are so many who are seeking to live with the basic necessities of life in this country that claims to be at the forefront of freedom and democracy and equality and justice, Dr. King was right. At some point, we have to help this government be true to the check it promised. Because we are weary, as Dr. King said, of that check returning insufficient funds. I'll close with this because they did tell me I had 4 minutes. If we are truly going to be the nation that we ought to be, we must take seriously those words that stand in the New York Harbor. There is a lady there that we call Lady Liberty. But before she was called Lady Liberty, she was called the Mother of Exiles. And when Emma Lazarus wrote that poem, she placed it there on the bottom of that statue. Send me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses, yearning to breathe free. If we are not going to make a mockery of those words, and if we are going to be true to the words of that declaration, then our government must seek to uphold the rights of all of its citizens and not dismantle hard-fought laws in our current day.
If we assume that Dr. King's biggest successes were changing policies of official institutional racism, and that the words aren't written down to be officially institutionally racist today, is the challenge for you in 2016 at Color of Change, fighting governmental institutional racism, different?
Absolutely. 2016 and beyond is not just about changing the written rules of policy that govern our lives, whether it's about changing rules around how prosecutors deal with police violence, whether it's about changing rules about money in our political system, but it's about changing a whole set of unwritten rules from how Hollywood informs our lives through the images that they put out, whether it's about how the unwritten rules that govern our everyday lives, not just about the rules of prosecutors, but how we use our political system to get bad prosecutors out of office. So civil rights today is not just about the marches and the work to hold government accountable, but it's about changing our culture. It's about holding corporations and holding our media accountable just as much as we hold our government accountable.
When we talked on the phone last week, you mentioned cultivating allies, including non-African Americans, to join the battle against institutional racism. Why is it important, and how do you do it differently than in King's Day?
In 2016 and beyond, for Black people, for all oppressed people, it's about translating awareness on our issues into real power. It's translating presence into power and not mistaking presence that we have a Black man as president, that we trend on social media, that we have TV shows that represent our stories for real power, because that's not the power to change the incentive structures about how we're treated, to change the ways that we are treated by those in power. Translating presence into power is what we have to think about as we work to build a new world for Black people and for all people. And that's going to be about bringing more voices into this work, bringing allies into this work, but understanding that it's not just about talking about our issues or being aware about our issues. It's about ensuring that Black people truly have power to change the incentive structure of this country.
And how important to that and those alliances do you think it is for white people to say out loud the words white privilege and confront their white privilege and talk to each other about white privilege?
Yeah. I mean, I think it's important. But I think those are just words, right? That's, once again, just presence. And so I'm not interested in white people just saying white privilege if it doesn't actually mean anything different than what it meant the day before. I'm interested in having a conversation about white privilege if it actually changes the incentive structure about how we fund public education in this country. I'm actually having a conversation around white privilege if it means about changing how we think about corporate power in this country, if it changes how we think about how we try police officers who kill unarmed Black people in this country. We're also talking about what happens at the local level, because just like a good doctor, you don't want to go in the office if something is wrong with your liver that you're operating on your heart. And there's something wrong with our criminal justice system at the local level. And there's something wrong with prosecutors who don't feel accountable and are not incentivized to do the right thing. So we've got to get them out of office. And we've got to build the power to get them out of office. And Color of Change, as a national civil rights organization with over 1.3 million Black folks and their allies of every race that works to mobilize people online and offline, feels it's our particular job to be in this space, to build the type of power that holds folks accountable. And when they get out of office, to remind them that they got out of office because they did wrong. And to remind the folks who get in office the next time that there will be someone watching them and holding them accountable and is not interested in taking big corporate money along the way. We have to think about what are the civil rights policies of our future, the policies that bring the voices of the modern issues that we're dealing with, whether it's the voices of Black folks or new immigrant communities or LGBT voices, the intersectional movements of our time that give everyday people a more powerful voice in our democracy, and push back against this trend of corporate power that pushes us all down, that increases income equality and makes us all less powerful in our communities. So to the extent that the Constitution in and of itself is a piece of paper, we the people have to express our will for a better future. And we have to do that by building power and connecting our voices and holding those in power accountable and putting people we want to see in power, there to do the right thing.
How can we inspire and engage agents of active empathy?
I think, agents of active empathy, we have to give them something to do. That's so much of what we think about as a color of change, is that we hear so much in this sort of modern day era of technology and online tools of hashtag activism or clicktivism. At Color of Change, we really think about, in the moment, when something happens, how do we give something clear to do? So in the moment, the aftermath of Trayvon Martin, we found out that there was this organization called the American Legislative Exchange Council that was behind the Stand Your Ground law that was shielding George Zimmerman. They were this right-wing group that created what they called model legislation. They were also behind the discriminatory voter ID law and the Arizona immigration policy. We mobilized our members not to hold ALEC accountable, but to hold the corporations that were supporting ALEC. 98% of ALEC's money came from corporations. Corporations who every single day came into our community and said, buy our products and use our services. And we went to those corporations and said, you can't come for Black folks' money by day and try to take away our vote or make us unsafe by night. And what we did was we mobilized our members and said, this is where we go. Over 100 corporations have now left ALEC because of our members' voices. They have a $1.5 million budget shortfall. They had to close down their swanky office in D.C. and move to a much smaller office in Virginia, and all because of the voices of everyday Black folks saying, not today. We will not just do things the old way. We will not take your money but we will mobilize our members and push for a different type of results.
Ladies and gentlemen, please thank Rashad Robinson.
Race Forward has been looking deeply into racial impacts and assessments. Can you say more about that work and also about the results you've been able to achieve?
Sure. One of the most promising practices around the country is of local governments and government agencies conducting a racial equity impact assessment of their policies and practices. Thank you. So the impact assessment works just like an environmental impact assessment does. So if you were going to put up a building, then in the planning of that building, you'd have to report on how it was going to affect the air and the soil, the water, the noise, the traffic, everything, the environment around that building. And if those impacts were found to be potentially negative, you might have to change the design of your building, or you might not get to put the building up at all. So the racial equity impact assessment works the same way. You think, well, we might want to adopt a zero tolerance policy for our public schools. You'd actually run the policy idea through a set of questions that would make it clear what its racial impact will be, or if you can examine past and existing policies this way as well. And one good example, for example, the city of Minneapolis, the school board, conducted a racial equity impact assessment of 2 school closings that it had projected. And it found that closing one would affect the Somali community heavily, closing the other would affect the Native American community heavily, and they ended up keeping one of the schools open, almost never happens when a school is slated to be closed, and making mitigation plans with the other community. The city of Seattle, the city of Portland, Oregon, the city of Madison, Wisconsin, the state of Iowa, the state of Connecticut, the school board in Minneapolis, all of these government entities use this impact assessment to guide racially equitable, conscious decision making, because they know that colorblind, quote unquote, colorblind decision making has done nothing but create more inequity to deal with the unconscious biases that people have, the institutional racism that often there's no single bad actor behind it. To deal with those, what you need is a proactive lens for looking at all of your practice and policy. And there are many local governments that are taking that up.
So, Janae, why should Black people still believe in the courts and the legal system as a mechanism for justice as we seek to be agents of change for our community?
That's a heavy one. To inspire faith in our legal system that continually lets us down, particularly in this context of police brutality, is a challenging one. And I say it's challenging for me as a lawyer, as an officer of the court, as someone who has decided to dedicate her life to fighting injustice through the legal system. It is something that has truly caused me to come back to my belief in why I came to this in the first place. And all I can do is think about the amazing progress that we have made through the legal system, and recognizing, as you and I were talking about a little bit earlier, this is never going to be something where we can have a victory and sit back and kick back and relax. We recognize that these are all building blocks to deconstruct what has historically been a system designed specifically to oppress Black people. And there's no other way around that. We have, through the court system, desegregated our schools. We brought the case, the Legal Defense Fund did, in 1954, Brown versus Board of Education. And yes, that desegregated our schools, but we still hold a docket of 100 desegregation cases where we are still in Louisiana and Mississippi and Georgia trying to get equity in those schools so that students can have a chance and a future and have educational resources that we all deserve if we are hoping to really achieve some sort of progress. We ended redlining, in theory, right? But we know through the economic crisis that that still comes up and there's still discrimination afoot. It means that we just can never go to sleep. That institutions like the Legal Defense Fund, like Race Forward, like the United Way, like many of our brothers and sisters in the civil rights struggle are necessary. We will never, I believe, be obsolete because that's the underpinning of this country. So I still have faith in this legal system. There are ways that we can transform some of the laws, some of the the statutes that allow it for law enforcement to effectively be above the law. That's one of the issues that the Legal Defense Fund is examining right now. We're also looking at obstruction of justice statutes that get at the fact that law officers can stand by, watch their fellow officers engage in misconduct, and then decide not to speak about it, report it, or cooperate with an investigation and not get indicted or charged. That cannot continue. So we're trying to use some of the laws that we have to bring accountability to all the officers, not just individual officers, but everyone in those situations, and also the entire culture of policing.
Sheena Wright, coming to you. We did ask members of the audience to submit questions when they RSVP'd, and more than a few mentioned the occupation of the wildlife refuge in Oregon by armed militants, who happen to be white, and local law enforcement and federal officials who have taken a wait-and-see attitude. At the same time, Cleveland police officers shot and killed 12-year-old Tamir Rice in less than 3 seconds. I'm giving him a second.
Yeah.
Is this dichotomy a direct reflection of the governmental role in the race privilege dilemma?
Absolutely. As Janae said, our whole country is built on the premise, on the foundation, and I think it was stated a little bit earlier today, we were 3/5 of a human. And our systems, our criminal justice system, our education systems, our economic systems, still, unfortunately, interact with people of color in that way. We do not have the same right to, assemble or bear arms or protest or just to walk down the street. And race becomes itself, it's almost like a crime, driving while black, all these things that we know. So the way that the criminal justice system interacts with any people of color who might be doing a similar or not similar thing, it's absolutely a result of who we are as the United States of America and what our institutions were designed to do.
How do we offer ownership to youth after we do the work of racism and equality?
One of the things we say at Race Forward that I think is particularly important for young people who are coming up in a country where the goal around having a multiracial society has become diversity. So every organization has a diversity committee, and there are many, many books about how to achieve diversity in our schools and our communities and our workplaces. But really, the thing is that diversity is about variety. It's about getting lots of different kinds of people into the room. But equity is about power and what people are able to do once they are in that room. So
we have uplifted this country in ways that really is just priceless and invaluable. We, more than any other group, I think, in so many ways have followed the rule of law to the T, have worked within systems to transform systems. And, here we are celebrating Dr. Martin Luther King. He said something that I think is so profound as we think about the Black Lives Matter movement and we think about other movements that are born out of this moment of tragedy. He said that a social movement that moves people is merely a revolt. A social movement that changes people and institutions is a revolution. And we want revolution. We want revolution in this moment. And our young people are seeking that. They are in the streets, and they are also talking about how do we just re-envision policing? How do we rethink education? How do we end this school-to-prison pipeline? How do we talk about economic equity? And how do we get at the financial institutions that have done such damage to our communities and to our individual wealth? We've lost an entire generation of black wealth around the economic crisis. How do we get at the institutions that actually perpetuated that? And that's really where the solutions are. We can work on individuals, we can work on groups, and that is key and important, but we also need to transform institutions, and youth have the power to do that in numbers, in their fearlessness, and in their persistence to get our issues to the fore.
Birth of a better way should be in young people's eyes. Public schools should be the wombs. Public schools are often the tombs for alternative thought. The status quo is bought and paid for at the level of primary education. Adjacent cubicle is as far as many of our young people are trained to see. So savage these inequalities, these unwritten rules seared in blue blood marrow. It harrows the heart, precision with which it clicks silent in our minds. Tell me, Dr. King, where in Speeches of Dreams might I find glimpses of these sons of former slaves and slave owners, sitting in corner offices of gold dome buildings? They read reports of public school structures with asbestos in the ceilings, overcrowded classrooms with undercompensated educators, elevators touch 3 floors, no way, no chance, do dirt. I'm flirting with the words of a masterful dreamer, attempting to coax answers out of the fine print. A hint of remorse does not exist. We mint his image and miss his message. New Jack militants scorn him as a McActivist. Every city in America bears a street with his name. The politicians mastered this game of nominative progress. Martin Luther King Boulevard, always home to the segregated projects. Somebody gotta see the irony. Ringing replete with the echo of August 63, ringing 41 shots deep into the heart of maniacal police. So savage these inequalities. We used to be angry at injustice, now we just irritated with bureaucracy. Dr. King, I've read the speeches, heard them all. We will not be satisfied till justice rolls down like water and righteousness like a mighty stream. Where in Speeches of Dreams might I see at last free? Resources denied to those in need, but supplied to the highest bidder. It violates constitutional democracy, falls right in line with national hypocrisy. Dare to dream regal, we dangle before these kids. Mass hypnosis, drones honed in to the media blitz, convinced the bling bling is the sound of freedom ring. King, did you see this moment while standing on your mountaintop? A mass movement to put 14-year-olds on lock with grown men? We spend extraordinary time mediating injustice. Thrust this apartheid at our young disguised as schools. No tools to thrive, only the fit survive. Some sling rocks, some rock mics. The cops is out like Gestapo in the night, herding up the new labor force for the all-seeing eye. So for whom, America the beautiful? Spacious skies merely mock the blackbird with crippled wing. We slice the blackbird's throat and ask her why she does not sing. No one remembers there was no head start, no exposure to art, of the wrong class, of the wrong cast, placed on the lower track at 6 years young, ain't recovered since. We ask the blackbird why she will not fly, while the law walking off with her wings. So savage these, only see equality in 63 black and white dreams. Is it so savage to dream at last free in Technicolor prism tinged in the right to be? Is it so savage to dream at last free? To dream at last free? Dream at last! Free at last! Free at last!
Can you tell us about some of the tactics Dr. King used to solicit active empathy?
Active empathy. Well, he was engaged across the lines of the people that disagreed with him, that opposed him, and that might argue with him constantly. He never sat in a closed space with people who agreed with him. So I think outreach, discovery, discipline, empathy will only take you so far if you don't add courage and discipline and discovery with it.
You've written about something Dr. King said after Bloody Sunday in Selma at a voting rights march, that no American can escape responsibility, that all are involved in the sorrow, his words. Was that a call to active empathy among white people around the country who could sit back and say, I didn't do that, I wasn't a violent segregationist abusing those marchers?
He was constantly trying to prick people's conscience above a very powerful tendency of evasion. to think that it was somebody else's responsibility. So yes, we are. If you believe in a government of we the people, then it's not just we the goodies. It's we the responsibility for everything.
You know, you're a white guy who's devoted much of your life to writing a trilogy of books about Martin Luther King. How did that become your thing?
It wasn't easy. I did my best to evade it. I grew up in Atlanta. My dad was a dry cleaner who had one rule, which was that people interested in politics can't find honest work, and that we should stay out of the movement because it was scary. And believe me, it was scary. But what happened was I was in the first grade the year of the Brown decision, and I graduated from college the spring Dr. King was killed. And all in between, the movement had this unbelievable tenacity that as much as I tried to avoid it, it went deeper and deeper in me, asking questions. I remember in 1961, the mayor of Atlanta adopted the motto in the middle of the movement, everybody trying to avoid it. They were scared. This is after the Freedom Rides. He said, "Atlanta is the city that's too busy to hate." That's still the motto from Atlanta. Kasim Reed still uses it today. So I went to school the next day and I said, "This is our motto? Doesn't that say that if we don't stay busy, our natural inclination is to hate?" So if we're boasting of this, what would we confess? And it just showed how big race was. It was seeping out in music and everything else. I saw people that were white kids that I thought were racist were the very ones that would sneak out and go down to hear Ray Charles at the Herndon Stadium. Or even go to the Royal Peacock Club to hear Jerry Butler and Jackie Wilson. So there was something going on, and the movement was very deep. So eventually, it turned my life's interests inside out against my will. So I wanted to know where this movement came from.
That's amazing. You tried to resist it. That's some story. This is our 10th annual King Weekend event. It's the 30th year of the MLK holiday. Congress passed it in 1986. You may. You wrote 10 years ago that King's legacy was surviving with more resonance than impact. More resonance than impact. What did you mean then, and how much do you still feel that way today?
Well, I think that it became something to honor and be nice to and pat on the head, which is kind of the symbolic resonance. When the longer you study the movement, the more you learn that the measure of it is your discomfort and your own internal discovery. Dr. King was pushing himself out beyond his limits every day, and I believe that the movement was built on personal discovery and courage, and not on simply passive honoring something. So to me, on the holiday, the best thing is not just to honor Dr. King or to go to a soup kitchen or something, but make yourself do something that makes you uncomfortable across the barriers that still divide this country, because that's what the movement did.
And we have a whole generation now that takes the existence of a King holiday for granted. Can you, as a historian, remind everybody young enough not to know of some of the struggle to get this holiday enacted even?
Well, I mean, to be short and be brief, I think the most instructive thing to say was that at the ceremony signing the legislation to make the King holiday a holiday, President Reagan said we wouldn't know for another 40 years whether or not Dr. King was a loyal American. He said it out loud. The bill was a compromise to put Dr. King up on a shelf and stop agitation, and in that sense, it was successful. So it's really, to me, it's a challenge to use the holiday to dig out the underlying message that Dr. King is about the future, really, not about the past, in the way we confront the injustices that are our age, the way he confronted them in his.
Are there things you'd like to see America do for this holiday that are more than just symbolic in the ways you were describing? Or is there nothing in particular, and it's really about what we do the other 364 or 5 days of the year?
I'd like to see schools restore music and theater and things that because they're not just passive bits of knowledge. It's learning how to engage one another in school, and that's what music and the arts do better than anything. I'd like to see people go into the prisons and talk to the people there about their lives and how they're going to get out. In other words, take a journey, because, empathy, you're talking about empathy. Empathy with hope is courage, and courage with vision is a movement. And the movement grew slowly, but a movement with discipline and outreach and courage and all the things that are part of it is really what the democracy is about. So that's why Dr. King that's why it's right to call him a modern founding father, as people did earlier, because he took the basis of we the people and made it into a journey that made everybody better. And that's the challenge that we should have now. I'd like to see us going into schools, going into prison, acknowledging that race is the most powerful force in our politics. To this day, it's not acknowledged. You go long debates and 24 hours of the 24-hour news cycle. The way it is now is that race is an exception or a timeout from normal politics. But it's really at the heart of all of our politics, and really always has been from the time it was the heart of the constitutional compromises, but the Constitution didn't mention slavery. So we've always been at odds over race, but evasive about it.
Audience question. Audience question from someone tweeting as, "It's only Twitter." King spoke of his disappointment in the white moderate. Do you see similarities in today's white liberal?
Well, well, we don't really even have many liberals today. We have progressives. A progressive is a liberal who'd rather not talk about race. Whereas conservatives say the word conservative 2 or 3 times in every sentence. When it's hard to understand exactly no conservative wants to kick women out of universities or go back to segregation. They don't have the courage of their convictions, but they claim that they've got a dominant sense of politics. We, the heirs of the movement, have many, many empirical miracles that are the legacy of this movement from a time when Dr. King said that the movement had unloosed the widest liberation in human history. That was before the women's movement, before the gay rights movement. He said that when Nelson Mandela was going into prison, long before people dreamed that he'd come out and end apartheid. We're heir to all of these miracles, but we're afraid to claim them. And therefore, and I think that we're afraid to claim them because people don't know that to do so, you've got to acknowledge the racial core, which is where everything started.
But you told me backstage, for all this talk, and we're hearing some of it today, about it's not enough to say the right words, it's not enough for individuals to change their individual consciousness. We have to deal with institutional racism. And you told me there's a danger, in your opinion, of focusing only on institutional racism. Why?
Well, I think that institutional and structural racism run a danger of it becoming like a pet phrase of being correct. In other words, it's an idea. We got to be mindful of what institutional racism is. It's a whole bunch of personal judgments. Like the Apollo Theater is an institution, but what's it built on? It's built on millions of people who are inspired by what they heard here, right? In a very personal and emotional way. Institutional racism is millions of decisions that coalesce into institutions, but they're all as personal as I don't want to go on that side of town. And it starts very personally. So I'm only saying that if we talk about institutional racism as though it's something that we comprehend and we can fix with an idea, we may miss the notion that it is profoundly human. It's been built up. You can't really deal with an institution without realizing that it's built on history, it's built on people, and it's got to be changed the same way.
Ladies and gentlemen, please thank Taylor Branch. Thank you.
Jose Antonio Vargas is a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist. He is a filmmaker. He is an immigration rights activist and the founder of Define American. So, Jose, why are you calling out white folks?
So I should say, by the way, I'm an undocumented immigrant.
For those who may not
For those
know
who
that
may
part
not
of
know
the
that part.
story.
Well, I'm just saying this because, the beauty of America, that an undocumented immigrant can come and speak at the Apollo Theater is like so beyond my imagination. So,
I love the way he says Apollo.
yes.
It's beautiful. It's beautiful. That's beautiful.
And I apologize for my eyebrows. Somebody actually made a Tumblr thing on it because of all the eyebrow stuff that's happening on the film when I'm calling white people out, as you said.
I didn't know this.
Eyebrow
Facial expressions are
it's just-
beautiful.
Well, so let me say this. So when I outed myself as undocumented, almost 5 years ago in the New York Times, I expected the government to come after me, but they did not. I do not know why. Ask them yourself. And we founded an organization called DefineAmerican.com. I'm sure you'll check it out. On Thursday, we are going to Des Moines and hosting a 3-day free Define American Film Festival. Yes, for free. So if you have friends in Des Moines, Iowa, please tell them that we're coming.
Way to hide.
Wait, yes. And the goal is, so the moment I outed myself as undocumented, we've been traveling nonstop with Define American, and people of color and immigrants always get asked where we're from, right? Where are you from, right? I'm really confusing to people because my name's Latino, I look like this, it's called colonialism, the Philippines, all that. So people get really confused, right? And I was at the University of Georgia in Athens. I was invited by a college Republican group. And I'm so happy that Taylor Branch said this. It is so important that we make ourselves uncomfortable. It is so important that we go to places. Look, as a gay, undocumented Filipino who majored in Black Studies guy, I'm uncomfortable all the time. So I go to this place, and so this young man was asking me these questions about why are you here illegally, what's the DREAM Act, all that stuff. So finally, I turned the tables around because I am a journalist, and I asked him, "Where are you from?" And he said, "Well, I'm American." Okay, I know, but where are you from? "I'm white." Well, white is not a country, right? Like, when did the Irish and the Italians and the Germans and the Jews, when did people become white? Are Jewish people white? I don't know the answer to that question. But okay, so much of our conversation about race in this country, look, I grew up in the Philippines. Every Filipino knows every Whitney Houston song because we learned to speak English because of Whitney Houston songs. I didn't know that Whitney Houston was Black until I got here, right? And so immediately, I was very confused about, well, wait a second. So if she's Black, then they're white. So if you're Latino or you're Asian, or you're, where do you fit in this dynamic? Right now in America, according to Pew, 55% of the total population growth in America in the past 50 years have come from Latinos and Asians. In the next 50 years, 88% of the total growth is going to come from Latinos and Asians. So where do we fit in that dynamic?
Okay, but you now have caused me to jump all the way to question 5.
I'm sorry. It's a lot to unpack.
No,
White people is a lot.
It's great, though. It's great because it actually comes from one of the questions that was submitted by our audience when they RSVP'd. They could submit questions. Yeah. And it points out, it's somebody who obviously saw the film White People, which is worth seeing in its entirety. It's free. And really, really challenging, as you say, challenges your ideas, whatever your ethnic or racial background. The person says, white people do not think of themselves as a race and often feel defensive when they are racialized. Should we be moving away from notions of race as a construct, or should we be asking white people to accept notions of whiteness as part of their responsibility in our society?
Since we are in Harlem,
I don't know that this person...
No, I'm just saying. I mean, we can't talk about Martin Luther King and not talk about James Baldwin, right? And this idea that we cannot change something we cannot face. And I would argue, as somebody who has been, most everything I've learned about this country, I learned from Baldwin and Toni Morrison, and kind of like, but this is where the school system is so important, right? This whole idea of whiteness as a construct is completely a new idea, not only to white people of a certain age, whatever that age may be, but to young white Americans. 3/4 of young white Americans, according to a poll that MTV did, MTV produced the film Would Define American, 3/4 of them said that being colorblind is the ideal, to not want to see race. And what gets really dangerous is now they're using Martin Luther King's legacy, right, in my opinion, somewhat defaming it and defacing it, to fit this idea of, well, why can't people just get over it, right? And so that's why this idea of challenging not only institutional racism, that's why, I don't know if you noticed, by the way, this film was really, thank God I'm so used to being criticized by my grandmother, so I can handle anything. So when this film came out, I was criticized by a lot of white progressive writers, journalists, who felt that I was not too hard on white people.
That you were too hard or not hard enough?
Not hard enough. Like when I said, I understand how you feel, they thought I should be beating her with the bush and saying, I don't understand. I don't know about you. At Define American, we've done more than 470 events in 45 states in the past 4.5 years. This, for a lot of people, is a lot, right? And this idea, now that white Americans are actually an emerging racial minority in the United States. In 2014, 2015, I live in Los Angeles. In Los Angeles, 72% of all women are women of color. 72%, right? I'm sorry, the same Los Angeles that's home to Hollywood that just had an Oscar so white, right? So, and let's Jami, and let's call people out about this. All the media institutions here in the East Coast, I don't want to name specific names because I've written for some of them, right? They write about us, but they don't necessarily want to hire us. Because the danger now becomes, why is it that only white journalists can write about people of color, and people of color can't write about ourselves because it's not objective enough, or that we have an agenda? That shit, sorry. I'm so sorry. So sorry. I'm so sorry.
Can we bleep that?
Please don't deport me. It must change. It must change.
On the words, it must change. Thank you, Jose Antonio Vargas.
Thank you for having me. Thank you.
Dr. Glaude, I've been reading your new book, Democracy in Black, and I see that you centrally use the phrase, a human values gap. Can you talk about that gap to start off this panel?
Sure. First of all, I'm so delighted to be in the historic Apollo on this extraordinary day. The value gap is really basic. We talk about the achievement gap, we talk about the wealth gap, we talk about the empathy gap. But there's something underneath all of that, and I call it the value gap. And what is the value gap? The value gap is the belief that white people matter more than others. So understand, it's the belief that white people matter more than others, and that belief animates our social practices, our political arrangements, and our economic realities. So no matter what the conditions are, whether it's slavery, whether it's Jim Crow, or whether it's a black man in the White House, if the value gap obtains, no matter what the inputs are, the outputs will still be the same. No matter what the inputs are, the outputs will be the same. So I suggest that if we're really going to get to this thing, we're going to have to look the value gap squarely in the face and close it.
I guess if white people, as we heard in the last segment, are so afraid of the day that we're not a majority anymore, maybe it's because we know how minorities are treated in this country. Ms. Diallo, you're very connected to Paris, the city of such conflict and devastation in the last year. If our title here is MLK's Two Americas, you've written about the two Frances that you see contributing to the rise of Islamist radicalism there. Where would you begin to enlighten the two Americas about the nature of the two Frances?
it took me time in France to realize that I was black, because our country has this ideology of colorblindness. And in France, it's not permitted to track minorities, so we don't know how many non-whites there are in France. And to me, colorblindness is white privilege, because you have to be white to allow yourself not to see race. Because when you're not white, you see that you're not right. Because being colorblind is being blind to the consequences of the color.
Dr. Glaude, I wonder if you want to just continue that conversation with Rokhaya Diallo. What might you add to continue to relate our domestic and global challenges, which we might otherwise think of as separate struggles? I mean, black people go to France, so they feel like race isn't the way they're perceived, first and foremost, from this country.
One of the things that we do know is that black people, people of color around the world, are catching hell. And part of what we have to do is stop dancing the dance and start telling people exactly how we feel and start mobilizing based upon that. Does that make sense? Right?
What was that about patriotism? Is American patriotism bad?
Yes. Well, let me explain why.
In all cases?
Right, no, I think patriotism, is borders on idolatry. We've been listening to Reverend Warren, right? I mean, there's a sense, Reverend Mike has made it clear. There's a sense is when we put the nation as the object of our concern, as the object of our love, then we set ourselves up for some very dangerous activity. Does that make sense? And part of what I'm trying to suggest, and I think we would all commit to this, and I know Dr. King was clear on this, particularly in the last days of his life, right? It's this belief that America is the shining city on the hill, that America is the Redeemer nation, that somehow God chose this place to deliver democracy to the world, has blinded this place to the evil that it has done, right? So, no, I'm not a patriot. No, I'm not a patriot. No.
Taylor Branch, what is your historical knowledge of Dr. King tell you about the conversation so far between our two other panelists?
It reminds me of I think movements don't go anywhere unless they're really arguing, and that one of the problems that we have is that there's too timid an argument. The most instructive engagement, or one of the most, from Dr. King's movement is the argument that he had for 200 miles with Stokely Carmichael in the summer of '66 on the Meredith March, in which Stokely says, Dr. King, why do only black people have to be nonviolent? Why does America admire nonviolence only in black folks, but otherwise they like James Bond and John Wayne? And Dr. King says, you're right, there's absolutely no justice that would require that black people be nonviolent. It is unfair to us. On the other hand, nonviolence is a leadership doctrine. We are ahead of white folks. If you define justice as votes and the promise, if you take the promise of equal citizenship and we the people seriously, it's about votes, and we're leading in that regard. We're still having that argument today about whether the essence of the democratic promise in the world is our soldiers or our creed. And nobody has that debate as openly and as. The great irony to me was that Stokely told me that that's when he and Dr. King became friends.
In France, black people tend to see the U.S. as a very fairyland for black people, because you have a black president, you used to have a black attorney, and we don't have that in France, and we tend to idealize the U.S. So I think that we have to celebrate, of course, the memory of Martin Luther King, but we have to celebrate the memories of all the anonymous activists that made him able to lead the march on Washington. And they are not only here in the US, but also in France, in UK, in Africa. And we need to honor their names, because we don't know them. And And for me, being able to say the name of Tumi Jaija, who started our march in France here at the Apollo Theater in New York, is very important because nobody knows him in France, and he was erased from the history. And whenever we have a march on racism in France, we have the posters of Malcolm X, of Martin Luther King, and we don't have even our, Frantz Fanon used to be French. He was French, but he's not famous in France. So I hope that today is a MLK celebration, but I hope that it will be a celebration for all the activists that allowed us to be here today. So thank you very much for being here.
I think it's really important as we gather on this day not to disremember Dr. King. You know that word that comes out of Toni Morrison's Beloved? Disremember. And there's a way in which, the way the nation embraces Dr. King is that and Dr. Branch, you know what I'm talking about, they empty out his radical witness. I mean, at the end of his life, Dr. King was speaking to a revolution of value. He was organizing garbage workers. He was talking about a fundamental reordering of this society. But all we get is this dream talk. But interestingly enough, and I'm going to be really quickly here, the dream talk is actually revolutionary. Let me say this really quickly. What these folk, whomever these folk are, want us to believe is that our only options are those options right in front of us. They are arresting our imaginations. They don't want us to see that this world can be different. Dr. King sacrificed his life. They blew the bottom half of his face off because he was trying to offer us freedom dreams, right? And so when we engage in our celebration of him, we must remember his radical witness, right? We can't disremember. We can't disremember. I agree with that.
You've called in your book for what you call a blankout for the presidential election this year, which is Black Americans going to the polls in great numbers and voting for all the down-ballot races, but not at all for president. Not voting for president?
Yeah. I wrote that when it was going to be Hillary Clinton and Jeb Bush. I'm not walking it back. Part of what I've been trying to think through, and you guys can help me out with this, is that every 2 to 4 years, people try to herd us to the polls like we're cattle chewing cud. And then they don't deliver anything. And what we've seen over the last years is just simply devastation across our communities. That 38% of African American children live in poverty. 38%. In Mississippi, 50%. Right? And so every 4 years, they come and tell us what they're going to do, and then they don't do anything. And so what I'm suggesting is that perhaps we turn out to the polls in record numbers without Obama on the ballot, and we vote downstream, and right at the presidential level, none of the above.
Now, we know what happened with Ralph Nader and all of that in 2000. Are you ready for President Trump or President Cruz as a result of that?
I think the better question is, are white folk ready for President Trump or President Cruz? All of this wouldn't matter if the Democratic Party would just simply be direct and come with a genuine and effective policy agenda that would address the suffering in our community. So why is the burden on black voters? Put the burden on them. But again, I wrote this when it was going to be Hillary Clinton and Jeb Bush.
But you're not walking it back. Taylor Branch, after Selma and everything else in the struggle for voting rights, how do you think Dr. King might hear something like the blankout, even if Jeb Bush and Hillary Clinton were the nominees?
Oh, well, I don't want Dr. King to argue with the professor here. He was generally for voting, and I am too. We all are, but Dr. King lived at a time, believe it or not, when his dad and all the black folks that he knew were Republicans. until 1964 when Goldwater opposed the Civil Rights Act and Johnson signed it, and the whole partisan structure of the United States turned on a dime. What does that show us? It shows us that only race has the power to change the partisan structure of our politics. Nothing else has remotely that power, and yet we don't discuss gridlock or cynicism or anything. Nobody asks what are its underpinnings, because everybody knows the answer is going to be underneath it. You scratch it, it's going to come up with race, and so they don't do it. So we view race as an intrusion into our politics when it ought to be central. It's not all, but it's central to everything. And until we get over that, but it's not new to be evading it. I grew up in Atlanta. My textbook said that the Civil War had nothing to do with slavery. I mean, where race is involved, people can convince themselves of anything to maintain an innocent sense of command.
I think, you know, really quickly, I think the way in which we need a strategy for the streets, a strategy for the courtroom, and a strategy for the ballot box. How we vote, I think, needs to be in alignment with what's going on in the streets. Yep. And what I think is what we need in this country is democracy in black. And what is democracy in black? It is the efforts and actions of black people alongside others to make real the idea that this is a country of the people, for the people, and by the people.
Amen. Amen.
That's what it's all about.
Eddie Glaude, Rokhaya Diallo, Taylor Branch.
Dr. King said, the hope of a secure and livable world lies with disciplined nonconformists who are dedicated to justice, peace, and brotherhood. The trailblazers in human, academic, scientific, and religious freedom have always been nonconformists in any cause that concerns the progress of mankind. Put your faith in nonconformists. In other words, the world is changed by those who are crazy enough to believe they can change it. And if you walk with that insanity, the world will have to adjust to every move you make, especially when you make that move in your strides towards justice. This is not the season to sit and be silent. This is not the season to watch and do nothing. This is a season to galvanize all your resources, pool all your energies, and make sure that in your lifetime it will be said that when the hour called and when the universe came calling, that you were not asleep while people were dying, that you were not asleep while others were fading away. Dr. King said, in the end, we will remember not the words of our enemies, but the silence of our friends. The ultimate tragedy is not the oppression and cruelty by bad people, but the silence over that by good people. Our lives begin to end the day we become silent about things that matter. And I quote Eugene Robinson, the columnist for the Washington Post. Last year, after the shooting of those beautiful people in Charleston, Eugene Robinson said, our society will end racism when it stops being racist. No time sooner. How will you answer? God bless.
We've been fighting for too long in front row of America, falling like Toussaint Louverture, Delgrès, Macandal, rising right back with Bob Marley's voice, with the fist of Muhammad Ali and King Pele's glory. Yeah, Moun sa yo mette vie yo en danger, Pour la paix, pour un jour, ça a changé. L'homme même à ton nom, yon pas songé.